You ever feel like the volume of your life got turned down, but no one noticed? Like you're still showing up, still replying, still functioning, but inside, you've already left? Yeah, that was me. At some point, I disappeared. Not from the world, but from myself. I smiled at people, while forgetting how my own laugh sounded. I said, I'm fine. So often it became a reflex more than a response. And one day, in the middle of scrolling, half-dressed, mid-bite, mid-life, I paused. Not because I planned to, but because something inside me whispered, this isn't it. I didn't know what it was. I just knew this wasn't it. So I vanished. Not dramatically, just quietly. I stopped answering. I stopped explaining. I stopped performing. I walked away from the noise, from the feed, from the never-ending scroll of other people's lives that I used to compare mine to, and I sat in the quiet. Not because I was brave, but because I was exhausted. There's a silence that feels like peace, and there's a silence that feels like a scream. This one was both. At first, my thoughts were loud, panicked. What are you doing? You're wasting time. Everyone else is moving. But slowly, the panic faded, and I started hearing something else. A breath, a whisper, a version of me I hadn't met in years. The me that didn't care about pace, didn't care about metrics, didn't care about being impressive, just real. I spent the first few days doing nothing, not productive rest, not wellness rest, just stopping. I stared at the wall, not because it was interesting, but because my mind didn't know where else to go. And in that nothingness, I started noticing everything. The way sunlight moves across the floor, the sound of my own breath, the thoughts that had been buried under dopamine and distraction. I realized I hadn't been present in my own life for a long time. I'd been managing it, but not living it. And so I asked myself a question I hadn't dared in years. What do I actually feel? The answer didn't come loud. It came slowly, like fog lifting, not happiness, not sadness, just ache. An ache for something I couldn't name, a home I hadn't found, a self I'd forgotten. So I sat with it, didn't run, didn't numb, just sat. And for the first time in forever, I wasn't chasing healing. I wasn't fixing myself. I was just being with myself. And that felt like the beginning. They say silence is empty, but that's not true. Silence is full of echoes you tried to avoid, of versions of you you thought were gone. In the quiet, I met a version of me I had ignored, not because I hated them, but because I didn't know how to hold them. That version was tired, not lazy, tired, from pretending, from pleasing, from pushing through days that never felt like mine. I remembered the first time I started disappearing. It wasn't one moment. It was a series of small exits. The day I said yes when I meant no. The day I ignored the lump in my throat. The day I smiled on cue while breaking in silence. Each moment, a quiet retreat from myself. And soon, I was a stranger with a familiar face. In the silence, I finally saw the trail of footprints leading back to that moment. The first compromise. The first time I told myself, it's not that big of a deal. It was. It always is. Because every time you shrink to fit someone else's comfort, you leave a piece of yourself behind. And if you do it enough times, you wake up empty. I wasn't empty because I lacked things. I had stuff, friends, tasks, schedules. I was empty because I abandoned my own depth for the sake of fitting in. So I sat, and I listened. Listened to the version of me I'd ghosted. They didn't scream. They didn't beg. They just whispered, I miss being real. I used to be real. Messy, curious, wide-eyed. But somewhere along the way, I traded wonder for worry, depth for doing, truth for trend. And it worked. Kind of. People liked me, or the version I showed, but no one asked if I liked myself. And worse, I stopped asking too. That's the part that stung. Not the silence from others, the silence from me. Because when you stop checking in with yourself, you become fluent in pretending. You get good at sounding okay, at looking stable, at playing normal, until one day you forget how to stop performing. So in the stillness, I stopped. No masks, no mirrors, no audience, just me. And the aching question, who am I when no one's watching? I didn't have an answer, not at first, but I had fragments, little flashes, memories that felt like déjà vu. The kid who used to draw for hours, the teen who cried during sad songs, the adult who still hopes even when everything feels numb. I started picking up those fragments, like pieces of a mirror I didn't know I broke, not to fix it, but to recognize my reflection again. Healing didn't feel graceful. It felt like remembering how to breathe, like catching yourself mid-scroll and asking, why am I escaping again? Like admitting, I don't know what I want, but I know this isn't it. Like making tea and drinking it slowly, as if presence could be steeped into water. I began walking again, not to escape, but to witness, to notice the way wind moves trees, to feel the weight of my feet on earth, to hear my own breath without background noise. These weren't spiritual moments. They were survival. Because when you've spent years racing past yourself, slowing down feels like resistance. And in that resistance, something started to shift. I stopped looking for a breakthrough. I started building a bond with my body, with my mind, with the part of me I kept abandoning every time I chose performance over peace. There were days I slipped, went back to numbing, back to pleasing, back to noise. But the difference, this time I noticed. This time I returned. This time I said, it's okay. We start again. And that small grace, that changed everything. Because healing isn't linear, it's layered. Some days you bloom, other days you break. And on the best days, you do both. I started writing again, not to share, just to hear myself think, pages filled with phrases like, I'm still here. I don't have to prove anything. Being is enough. They weren't mantras, they were lifelines, proof that I was no longer disappearing, but returning, to myself, for real this time. I thought coming back would feel like failure, like surrendering to the noise again, like giving up on the silence that had finally started to feel like home. But it didn't. Coming back felt like choosing, not choosing the world over myself, but choosing to bring myself into the world, on my terms. I didn't reinstall every app, didn't blast a comeback post, didn't say, I've changed, because real change doesn't announce itself, it just shows up different. I opened my phone one morning, not to scroll, just to breathe, to look at a blank note and write, still here, still learning, still me. That was it. That was enough. Returning wasn't loud, it wasn't even clear, it was foggy, messy, scattered, but it was honest, and after months of performing, honesty felt sacred. I started talking to people again, but slower, with space, with choice. I stopped responding out of guilt. I started pausing before yes. I replaced urgency with presence, and not everyone liked it. That was hard, because being yourself means you'll lose some people who only loved the version you curated. But being yourself also means you'll finally meet people who see you, really see you, without the filters. I no longer craved being liked. I wanted to be known, not by everyone, just by the ones who mattered, and more importantly, by myself. That's what solitude gave me, not an escape, but a mirror. It showed me who I'd become by accident, and who I could still become by choice. It reminded me that I don't owe the world a version of me that's easy to digest. I owe myself a life that feels like mine. So I rebuilt. Slow, imperfect, real. I set boundaries, not as walls, but as invitations. This is how I move now. You're welcome to walk with me, but I won't abandon myself to keep up. I started celebrating things I used to ignore, like mornings without alarms, conversations that didn't drain me, art I made with no intention of sharing. I reclaimed little joys I used to scroll past. I began trusting silence again, not as absence, but as presence. I stopped fearing being alone because I'd finally made peace with the person I was alone with. That was the gift. Not peace that came from controlling life, but from no longer controlling myself. I thought disappearing would fix me, but it didn't. It introduced me to the version of me I forgot was still waiting, quiet, patient, whole. Sometimes I still vanish, not to run, but to return, because disappearing isn't always escape. Sometimes it's remembrance. Sometimes it's the most honest thing you can do. So if you ever feel yourself fading, if the noise gets too loud, too constant, too sharp, let yourself disappear. Not forever, just long enough to remember who you were before the world got so loud. And when you return, don't rush. Take your time. Carry your silence with you. Because now you know, you're never really lost. You just needed to be quiet enough to hear yourself come home.